I think we guys are live. Everyone, thank you for coming on to this sort of 1 hour of discussion on the next decade of Indian fintech. The idea really is to try and switch on our looking glasses, our crystal mazes, and see what we can foresee in terms of some key headline trends. Um, I think the first is, of course, hope everyone who's here, panelists, attendees, if everyone's safe, sound, take care of your families. I think the message that we have been giving our portfolio companies is literally live to fight another day. Let's just focus on friends, on family, on loved ones, on colleagues, employees for the next 2, 3 weeks. And when things settle down a little bit, I think business can come then. So I think it's family and lives first, business is second, at least right now. But thanks everyone for attending. Why don't we get start? I think the idea is 2, 3 things. One is we have sort of 3 sector experts. We have Kshitij from Ziploan, who understands lending, especially fintech, unsecured lending, as good as anybody else. We have Rohit of Decentro, who's really got the front row seat on API banking, open banking, and banking as a service, especially in India and Asia Pac. He's also a celebrated speaker, multiple panels. And of course, let's keep the VCs for the last. So I have Anand from Nexus, was previously country director for Bima. I'll let them have their introductions, but over to you, Kshitij. Perhaps you can give us an introduction and what you got you to start Ziploan.
Sure. Thanks, first of all, for this, Ravi, and having me on this panel. So hi everyone. My name is Kshitij. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Ziploan. At Ziploan, we provide business loans to small businesses, micro businesses. For the last 5 years that we have been around, we have disbursed close to about 400 crores and given out loans to about 10,000 plus small and micro businesses. The idea behind setting up Ziploan was that when it comes to small ticket loans, especially in the business segment, larger financial institutions have typically stayed away from this because of the higher OPEX. So the idea always has been how we could reduce the OPEX and be a more efficient lender to this segment. And I think, when we started back in 5 years back, at least for me personally, 3 things lined up. I would say passion, opportunity, skill set. And that's when the time we started. So yeah, happy to do my bit of sort of, building out the unsecured business loan market, for this segment in India.
And Kshitij, a quick update on your background as well. What were you doing before Ziploan? I think that will also give our attendees a context.
Sure. Thanks, Ravi. So prior to Ziploan, spent about 10 odd years with various private equity funds, wherein the idea was to invest in SME, companies in India. Also invested in a microfinance company, helped them scale, close to about 10x in about 3 odd years. And that was a time when, I also realized that, I would want to start something of my own. So that's about me in as brief as possible.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kshitij. Over to you, Rohit. Would love to get your introduction and your journey to Decentro.
Sure. Thanks, Kshitij, and thanks, Ravi. So I think just a quick brief about myself. I've been in the fintech space now for almost 7 years and counting. Started my journey before fintech in Sony. So I've been a product designer in Japan. Worked there for 2 years, and pretty much being a product guy. So love tinkering with products, both hardware and software. Soon realized that, of course, software was where the impact was higher and the pace was higher as well in the country, and there were much harder problems that could be solved at a much faster pace when it comes to software. So transitioned on to fintech, and this came in primarily from my own personal pain point back in 2014. Almost 2 years out of college, we had that classic challenge of how do you share money with friends, right? Without making it super awkward, when it comes to money. So Venmo became like an inspiration for us. I mean, those who are familiar with the US market, and there are a couple of other analogs, in other parts of the world, but nothing like that, existed in India. And the only way to share money was either cash or Paytm, for a long time. So we wanted to build something like UPI before UPI existed. And that is how we started interacting with the banking infrastructure, like the IMPS APIs, so on and so forth. And that was the first glimpse I got into the entire banking world, so to say. And the company did fairly well. The company's name was MyPool. We essentially raised a couple of rounds of funding from a couple of amazing angels, including Rajan, Sharad from Yahoo, a couple of other great guys as well. And then finally, got acquired by this US player called Wibmo, which has been in the payments authentication space for almost 20 years. And then these guys further got acquired, so went to a second M&A by PayU, which of course is a whole different, size corporation altogether. Got a chance to work across APAC as part of the PayU and Wibmo experience over the last 3 years, and then noticed the same banking challenge, the whole infra challenge at the APAC level beyond India, and realized a lot of similarities in that side as well. And then finally came to the conclusion that, okay, this is something which is not just impacting startups, but it's also impacting big companies and marketplaces and corporations, across the globe. So, for India to have massive B2C and B2B fintech successes, the way US has seen, you have to have this underlying infrastructure, right? So that's how the, essentially Decentro's thesis got born.
No, fantastic. And I think as VCs, one of the things that we always look for is horses for courses. And I can't think of anyone better than you with your background to run the race that you have chosen to run, right? Thanks, Rohit. Anand, over to you. And as part of introduction, would also perhaps also club in your experience as the country head of Bima for India and APAC. Bima has been incredibly successful outside of India, but they haven't so much in India. So would love to get your introduction and then as to what worked, what didn't work, and some key learnings from that, right? Just from an insurtech perspective.
No, absolutely. Like, yeah, that statement that Bima is exceptionally successful outside of India, not in India, also.
I have no doubt that you gave it your blood, soul, and sweat as well.
No, but it has a huge learning. This thing I'll share as well. But thanks for having on the panel, Ravi. We have had some great discussions among ourselves in our one-on-one sessions on fintech as well, and would love to have this share in this group. So I'll keep it quick. Like right now I'm working on investment in Nexus and look into fintech, insurtech, SaaS very deeply. That's the area where I'm trying to go deeper into. Prior to that, as Ravi mentioned, I was the country head for India. I joined them as the India CEO back in 2016. We struggled with the regulations in India, and we can touch upon insurance, fintech overall is a highly regulated industry. There was a 49% FDI limit on insurance in India for the agency and the brokerage businesses as well. We struggled with that. Telco was another route we were taking. We struggled, but then we decided that the better allocation of capital is probably towards Indonesia, Malaysia, and that's what we launched. Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines. So ran the growth markets in Southeast Asia and Asia for Bima. A bit of a background before that, yes, as you can make out, I am quite old. So I started my career with consulting, bunch of years in Bain, most of it in India, then a couple of years in the Valley before I came back, and then I joined Franklin Templeton. So my financial services foray with them started back then in 2014. I joined their global strategy team on the wealth tech side and trying to see what we can do in wealth tech. Quit that to join as a founding team member of one of the companies which actually Ravi has invested in. It's called Magic Pen. Quit that to start up again on fintech side, where I did a lending business for some time, and that alternate lending business actually did not take off. Ironic as it is, I struggled to raise fund. This was 2016 when the cycles were what it could be 1 year from down here. So that's what we were going through in terms of cycles, and then that's when we folded and I joined Bima. So that's a long story, but yeah, looking forward to this discussion and sharing whatever I've learned in this way.
And I hope you didn't quit Magic Pen because of us.
I'll talk about it later.
We'll keep it offline.
Just joking. They're a fantastic team. I would join them eyes closed anytime.
Agreed. No, I agree. No, super. Thanks for that, Anand. Let's just jump right. So, you are in the firing zone of COVID in every imaginable way. Things were super positive for unsecured lending 3 years ago as well. And then COVID hit us a year and a half ago. So talk us through what has been the impact of COVID on unsecured lending, both SME, consumer. Of course, you are specifically in consumer. What has been your experience, key learnings, and perhaps some key things to take forward? And as we speak, we're in the middle of a second massive pandemic, right? So
Yeah, sure. Happy to share that, Ravi. I think for us, right, given that we have been the business loan space, right? One of the things that we saw last year was that this whole lockdown thing impacted people's earnings very badly, right? And that's where I think everyone started prioritizing their expenditure or saving for a rainy day, right? Or sort of figuring out how to sort of get some relief on some of these things. And which is where I think when the government announced the restructuring scheme, right, I think it was a relief for many, right? Whether it was for these customers or even for some of the lending institutions as well, right? But I think what it did get us thinking a lot is in terms of reimagining our business model. So as you are well aware, right, initially we would do a lot of sourcing through third parties. But when COVID happened, right, we realized that we need to be closer to our customers, right? Be a bit more linked to them, understand their business in more details. And which is where, when we kick-started business post-COVID, right, post that pause, we sort of reoriented everything towards a direct sourcing piece, right? And I think that has been very, very helpful for us from that day till now. Second, I think what also helped us as an organization is prioritize a lot many things internally, right? Because typically in an organization, especially a startup, right, I think there are too many projects, too many initiatives going on, right, which does add up to a bit of a chaos. So I think what helped us do is we were very clear to fix what is essential to us, what is essential for Ziploan. And when we started prioritizing that, right, I think we realized that we were able to rationalize and optimize a lot of our processes, a lot of our costs, right? And the third thing, the most important thing is, I think somewhere COVID accelerated the pace of digitization, right?
Yeah.
So the projects that we thought we will execute over 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, suddenly everything was executed in a quarter or so. So I would say, I think, if one could have said that, yes, COVID first wave was an obstacle, but I think somewhere we as an organization use this as an opportunity to reset the business, rebuild the business, sort of focus a lot more on the digitization part of it, cost optimization, which is where, right, as you as an investor would know, right, we have been able to cut down our OPEX by half, right, now just because of this. So yeah, and now there is this second wave of COVID coming in, and I hope all the listeners, everyone is sort of staying safe. But we will again use this time to push the digital envelope a bit more further, redesign some of our existing processes so that again, a bit more cost optimization, digitization can happen, right? And and I believe probably this time around, right, I think we are much better sort of tuned to deal with this particular situation, right? Again, I think, at least for us at Ziploan, right, we applied this theory of constraints to sort of get our act together over the last 12 months. And I think that has been very helpful for us.
Very interesting. I'll come back to you on that pushing the envelope on digital in just a second. But just switching to Rohit. Rohit, give us and give the audience a sense on where sitting today, where you're sitting, where do you see banking as a service in India? Can you take some lessons from Europe, because we have multi-billion dollars in each subsegment within BaaS in Europe and the US, and of course, right, you will obviously weave in what Decentro is doing. Right? Give us that sense, please.
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's definitely the early days in India, but the good thing is that the pace of growth is extremely fast, right? And in fact, we were surprised by the demand that we were receiving, and not a lot of people know that, by the way. But just to give a quick backdrop around it, so Decentro, when we started last year, and we actually just completed our first year anniversary.
Fantastic! Month. Congratulations!
Yeah, thank you. And so we incorporated in April when the first lockdown was happening, right? So it's like crazy times of just jumping ship and starting a company at that time. So the entire company was like born, raised, and pre-funded in the lockdown time in the first 3 months, right? When we started, and initially the idea was actually to go to the developed market first. So that was my thesis, where I thought, okay, that countries like Singapore and Hong Kong are moving much faster when it comes to banking as a service. So why not do that first, right? Why not use that API infrastructure, right? And then solve, for other countries. But then I realized that, I mean, even though those countries are definitely ahead when it comes to the availability of APIs, like purely from a banking world, um, two challenges remain, right? Which is very different when it comes to India. One is the countries have their own set of regulations, so that's one thing you have to navigate. Second is the demand of the market, right? So supply side is fine, but the demand of the market itself is something that needs to be balanced. And that's when I noticed that, okay, I mean, even though India was in the early stages, but the month-on-month growth in terms of the requests, right, from customers, both in terms of embedded banking, embedded finance, and a couple of verticals that were emerging, that was enormous, and that is still pretty high if you look at the numbers. So I think that is something which really, really caught my attention, and that is what caused us to shift gears, and focus on India first, and then the other countries later on. So that's one thing I think. And second, from if you compare to the global analogs, with US and Europe, those countries, of course, have been, at this whole embedded banking piece for the last couple of years now. And there, the problem is different. Like the problem there is that many of the banks don't even have APIs. And so if you look at the US, for example, most of the banks didn't really have. In fact, even right now, they don't have basic exposition APIs of data, right? And that is why Plaid became so successful. Versus in Europe, it's of course more regulatory driven, where pretty much everybody has to expose those APIs no matter what, right? So India is, like, I would say, at a good hybrid position where the regulation is just shaping up. RBI has not really officially put in structures in place, but then the good thing is most of the banks themselves have authority on their own data sets, and their own APIs. So that's something which is leading to a good, healthy cycle of innovation, right?
Understood. And just a very quick follow-up question. Sitting today, in your mind, what gives you confidence that over the next, let's say, decade, that it is truly the decade for BaaS and infrastructure builders like yourself? What gives you that confidence?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think two main things, right, give confidence. One is the market itself, right? So if you look at the number of inquiries that we get, I think on an average, I can easily count, these going into 5 to 10 inbounds every day, right? So these are like 5 to 10 customers just coming on the website, discovering us somehow, through Google search, social media, press releases, etc., and then signing, right, without us really going and finding them. So that's one thing that really shows that, okay, people are looking out for solutions, right? And it's a mix, right? It's a mix of startups as well as mid-stage, late-stage companies.
Right.
Then the second thing is many of these corporations, right? Massive, like legacy corporations who have been in the country for the last 10, 20 years. These guys are now looking to embed banking and finance. So this is something which, is even new for them. And they're actually trying to find out, okay, what's the best way to go about it. And it takes a while to really understand what their motivation is. But once you start talking to them, then you realize that they're actually serious about it. So I think these two things combined really give us that confidence that, okay, a banking as an infrastructure player has to be present in the country.
Interesting. No, thanks. Switching, Anand, obviously, right, I think you have spent both time as an operator, as an investor in InsurTech. And so would love to take a stock from you on where is InsurTech today in India, because at least to me, it seems like capital is chasing effectively sort of two models. One is the large aggregated Policybazaar type models, and then the full stack Digit and Acko, etc., where they control end to end, right? So really, is there a missing middle in InsurTech in India in your mind? So happy to get your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely, Ravi. There are multiple other segments which will come up in insurance. If you see the financial products, the way they happen, right? There are four main financial products: payments, lending, you have wealth, and you have insurance. And they differ in the gradation that comes out. So payments is basically you are in the flow. You do not have to you flow with that, and as a company, you take money. Lending is where you are giving money to as an organization to the customer. So you do not have to sell. The customer asks, and you are the approver. Wealth is you are taking the money from the customer, but then you are obviously promising and are regulated that after a some time that money will definitely come back. Insurance is the only product where you are taking money from someone and saying that, hey, if some incidents happen in good faith, I'm going to give you money. So it's a very highly complicated product to sell. And that's why it's the one of the biggest push product. Nobody wakes up next day thinking I'm going to die there and I'll. That's why it's not surprising that the first level of investments that has happened is from the distribution side, where the policy bazaars of the world came up and they said that, we'll make distribution digital and which will make it easy. After that, what happens is that, exactly from my experience, what we were talking about, the insurance being a very regulated entity, and regulation is also higher because of this factor that somebody will have to maintain this trust layer. If otherwise people give money and the organization stop giving money on an incidence on some pretense, then this entire industry will go down. And that's why, because
Yeah.
of this regulation on the other side, it's very difficult to innovate, and there is very less risk taking over there. But and that's where you are seeing now. Then the other playing is more like the Acko Digits of the world, where you go full stack and take the license and say that I will bear the risk of innovating, and for that I need massive amount of capital, and I will
Yeah.
invest for this. However, if you see that there are insurance spaces which are coming up, which are more not in both the spaces, where like the incumbent insurance companies realize that they want to take certain risk, but something is either too small for them right now or either too innovative for them to take it up. And that's where they are pairing up with technology companies to go and see whether they can work together on that. And you'll see there are use cases, and specifically, I think health is a very, very large use case in India, because globally 65% of the insurance burden or the healthcare burden is taken by the employers or the insurers. In India, it's only 3%. So given that, we believe that employer-employee insurance and other such spaces will be taken up by the new players. The second opportunity that will emerge is like insurance companies are the back end is made to serve for underwriting processes which are for high LTV and low frequency use cases. So you are writing for something which is a lifetime value of like 50 years or something, and that sort of underwriting models. Whereas the use cases which are therefore unserved by these markets are which are high frequency, low ticket size, low turnaround. That's where the other sort of innovations will start coming, which is more in the embedded insurance and the other spaces that you'll see. That Jongan was the starter of that, obviously pioneer in that. And after that, Trav and other global insurance companies have come up. But I think that is some area on embedded insurance that you'll see. Distribution still will remain large part, and you'll see large players getting larger, or there will be players like, for example, we have an investment in Turtlemint. We are seeing very, very good action over there. Where with this COVID push, where the insurance companies are realizing that they do not have the. You'll see in March when the lockdown was put there. If you see the industry numbers, it sharply went down. While with the
Yeah.
COVID, you would actually think that it should have gone up. But what happened was that the insurance companies generally in the month of March is when they collect the premiums, and they were digitally not prepared and they could not collect the premiums at all. So even on the distribution side, the penetration of the digitization is very low. So you'll see a lot of these agencies and all of these things actually pick up. I'm quite actually bullish on InsurTech as a space, and there will be multiple innovative use cases that still come out of this space.
Understood. We'll hold that thread on distribution and product innovation just for 1 second. But very quickly, Kshitij, moving on to you. You've been in digital lending for the last 5 years. In your mind, how has sort of digital lending evolved in the last 5 years, right? What have you seen the biggest positive triggers with the regulatory ecosystem wise? What has really worked, and what would you like to see going forward?
Sure. Ravi, frankly, I think on the digital lending space, I think it's really sort of a big growth that all of us have seen over the last 5 years, right? Even if you look about people's behavior today, right, rather than they reaching out to larger banks and lining up in that queue for that loan, right? People know that applying on an app is much more convenient, right? There's a lot of seamless journeys that people go through, right? And I think a lot of this also has been possible because of the digital infrastructure, right? The regulatory infrastructure that also came in place, whether it's Aadhaar, UPI, BBPS, GST, right? I think all of this have had a big role to play in this evolution of the digital lending landscape, right? And somewhere I think the fact that there was also this development in the in the ecosystem with a lot of VCs coming in and backing first time founders. I think that role can also not be ignored, right? So I think both of this has brought about a big sort of growth in digital lending, and also I would say diversification. For example, I think even in the fintech space, right, as Anand mentioned, right, there is payments, lending, insurance, and wealth. And if you just pick up lending as one of the pillars of this fintech industry, there are so many different sorts of players, right? There is a full stack player like us, right, end to end sort of, right from sourcing, underwriting, collections, and then partnering with banks. And then there are startups who are doing lending as a service. There are startups which are essentially into, let's say, credit underwriting using a lot of data stuff. Then there are other players in the, let's say, identification sort of setups, right? So it definitely has evolved over the last 5 years into various facets. And I think we are somewhere in the Lego movement of the Indian fintech industry, wherein this innovation will keep on continuing, right? And I think people will collaborate at some time, or probably at the right time when they feel they would want to. But I think few more models are still yet to emerge. But yeah, I think that's what probably the finance industry also wanted, right? So yeah, I think a lot has happened, and I would expect a lot more innovations to keep on coming going forward, Ravi.
Look, you have an interesting point where you said that there are lots of subsector players and a full stack lender like you. In your mind as a fintech founder, right? So today you have guys who will just do KYC for you, guys who will just do underwriting for you. They have underwriting algorithms which perhaps have been perfected. There are emerging players who are doing just digital collections. So the fintech full stack lender, what of these would you outsource and what of these do you want to keep in house?
Yeah. So very, very good question, Ravi. And I think we have always discussed this even in our sort of leadership meetings. And the only answer, the way we have looked at it, right, is that if something is commoditized, I would rather we outsource it. But if there is any specific skill set, a specialized skill set that something requires, we would keep it in-house. Now, I don't want to get into what is commoditized, what is specialized skill set. It will open a lot of sort of different viewpoints here.
But you stop my follow-up question, but keep going.
So, but I think that's a filter we have adopted, Ravi, internally. If we know it's commoditized, there are plenty of people out there doing that. I don't think so there is any relevance in we using our bandwidth and recreating something that 20 other players have already done, right? We would rather keep our bandwidth focused on a specialized skill set that we would want to keep in-house. So that's the rule that we have followed so far.
And that's also a great message to any fintech founders who are listening, right? That if there are tons of players who are doing a very specialized subsector, then that's at least how full stack players perhaps might view you. So you would rather focus our energies on something building very specialized, where you bring in enough value for folks like Ziploan, from the larger guys, to say that, you know what, it makes sense for us to work with you and do business with you. For the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to start putting them on. I'm happy to take them as we go along. Rohit, switching to you, one of the things that has been the challenging part with the space that you are is that at least the banks have been, I think that some of the banks are doing a lot of good work, the yes banks of the world, etc. But in general, they all have archaic core banking systems. The tech teams perhaps don't understand how do you build robust APIs that work at scale. So how do you think of working with banks today? What has been that journey with banks? What banks do you want to call out who have done phenomenal work? And as a follow-up question to that, actually I'll pause, right? What has been your experience and what banks do you want to call out? And then I'll poke further.
Sure. Yeah, no, you're right. I think, like as I mentioned, right? So India is still, I would say, in the fairly early stages when it comes to the robustness of APIs, right, from the banking world. But then it also creates that opportunity, right? It creates the opportunity of coming in at an early stage and building those relationships, right? And making sure that both sides of the equation are pretty happy. So because if you come in too late, then the banks might themselves, be in a position and they might not really realize the value of banking as a service infrastructure. Although, of course, that's a whole different debate altogether, of how you create a multi-bank environment or a multi-bank switchability environment for many of these companies to use. So that's one thing. I think to call out the names, of course, Yes Bank for sure has been phenomenal. They're one of our earliest partners. ICICI is the second one, which we just announced a couple of days back. And they have done like amazing work as well, over the last, I would say, few years. Then there are a few of the new ones that are really catching up very fast. So you have Equitas, which is catching up very fast, actually converting, soon into a scheduled bank. Then you have a few of these newer banks, right, which have lesser market share, like Axis, for example, but are being very aggressive when it comes to identifying opportunities. And I think the interesting thing here to note is there are multiple reasons why companies need multiple banks, or why a banking as a service player like us needs multiple banks in the background. So one is, of course, as I said, the business and the tech redundancy, right? So to make sure that you have a really robust environment, and any black swan event does not impact the company at the end of the day. That's one. And then second is different banks have different priorities in terms of segments. So you'll realize that, for example, someone like Axis is very bullish on the retail side, right? So while someone like an ICICI has been very bullish recently on the SME side, right? And both segments are fast growing, right, in India, if you look at it, right, from a numbers point of view. So that whole upside is huge, on both the sides. That really makes sure that you have a healthy balance of some of these banks coming together and working together to create an APIs over time. And I think quality is something which really is a function of time and effort. Few of these banks which I mentioned for sure have decent quality when it comes to APIs. So we're actually able to use it. Of course, it takes a few months initially, but it's a one-time effort. And then we are sorted, for any company that wants to use. The rest of the banks are catching up. They're yet to reach a level where they are able to expose and go live with the APIs in like a few months' time. But yes, I think maybe in a few years we should be there.
So two sort of follow-up questions. So there are maybe about 7 to 8 players in the sort of banking as service, including yourself, Yap, the Zeta, etc.
Right.
Today, is there a land grab in terms of each of you working with a specific bank, and hence the bank has already worked with you? They probably may not want to work with another player. Question one. And question two, India is very skewed because if you have, let's say, maybe 4 to 5 banks, you're covering perhaps 60, 70, 80% of the volume.
Yeah.
So then does it really make sense to work with some of the long tail of commercial banks and smaller banks and cooperative banks, etc.?
Right. Yeah, great points. I think, so on the first one, we haven't really seen, I would say, an exclusive kind of a system, except maybe 1 or 2 very small cases. So a few of these, for example, foreign commercial banks, that are coming into India, they are, building out the infrastructure actually. So they are like, more like at a day zero stage where they don't even have the, their own infrastructure or their own APIs to expose to the customers, right? So for them, I think it might make sense to like work with someone like a Zeta or someone for a couple of years and build out their infra first and then expose it to others. We don't really go for those. I mean, from a decentralized perspective, we don't really go for those partners at this stage. And there's a business strategic reason behind that. Coming to the second one, from a distribution perspective, that power law will remain, right? And that's actually beneficial for us, I would say, for us as well as our customers, because then the choice reduces to like these 6, 7 major banks that really have a significant API capability, and second, a significant market share or a market outlook in terms of acquisition. So as long as these 2 things are healthily balanced, I think that those 6, 7 banks are in a good position to really capture this banking service.
Interesting, very interesting. Switching to you, Anand, you guys are investors in Onsurity. So could you talk us through the sort of investment thesis, the thought process of that investment, just so that, because obviously it's a very innovative and creative model, but would love to understand more from your own perspective.
Sure. It ties back, Ravi, to the point that we discussed, that employer-employee benefits in India is completely skewed, and mostly because unlike West, here the average size of the organizations are much lower. What works for like most of the employer-employee insurance or the group insurance right to serve are for companies which are either more than 200 or 300 employees per organizations. And there it's a commoditized product. There you can just become a
Yeah,
and most of those are not even making money because the insurance companies make money on float and they do not make money on the brokerage. It's driving down the prices. But if you go into think about the organizations like a small SMB, for lack of anyone, let's think about our VC firms as a small SMB, right? Like we get it. Maybe not the right example. Let's take a CA firm as a small SMB sort of a thing. You have like 10 employees or 15 employees. They generally do not have access to group insurances at the prices which most of the other people have, and it then becomes for them going through the process through a broker. Brokers are also not very keen to work with this segment of the segment of, and then if you think about it, 90% of the Indian market is in that segment. So the problem statement, if you think about it, was this, that how do you create the tech stack, because this has to be led by tech and it can't be ops heavy, and work very closely with the insurance companies to get products which can like cater to the health needs of employees of this specific type of employers. It broadened a little bit into the employer types where employer employee benefits are all, relationship is also not very clear. So you
right.
might be employee, and bunch of things came out in learning, like for example they do not want to pay the insurance premium in one go. It has to be monthly take. Most of the insurance companies are not able to provide such a monthly installment insurance with PED and other things covered. But the process of onboarding without impacting the promoter has to be very smooth. So if you look at Onsurety or compare to any of its competitor, Onsurety is able to do it within 1 hour, whereas any normal broker will take 15 to 30 days to do that. So all
Right.
this small thing piled together into one solution has a very strong proposition, and that's where they are seeing a very strong product market fit. Like they are already covering, I think, 900 to 1,000 SMBs, if not more already, and around close to around 80,000 to 90,000 lives is how strong they are seeing a product market fit. So
No,
I
no,
believe that problem statement, and if solved well, there will be a large opportunity, multiple large opportunities that will get created over there.
no, no, very interesting. And as a follow-up question, right? I mean, group health has an interesting nuance where regulations don't allow retail health prices to jack up based on claim ratios, but group health can literally be double depending on the claim ratios of a year. So, and that generally has been a barrier both for smaller companies to buying group insurance. And second, that because of that's the case, then when the next year comes about for renewal, it becomes a price game between sort of several competing brokers. So how does sort of Onsurety handle that? And how do they sort of make sure that they don't get stuck in just a pure price game?
Yeah, because like this. First of all, that game happens for very large groups, right? For smaller groups, the brokers don't even go and try to waste their time over there, and that's where technology comes into play. The second part is the problem of that entire thing is that in your group, if one incident happens, then the insurance company underwrites you as that small one group. Whereas if you think about it, ideally what should happen if there is one CA firm, maybe this incident has happened over there, but if your portfolio has 10 CA firms, and if you underwrite it for the pooled it up as one group of 10 CA firms, your prices should not go up that much. So if you are thinking about a small SMB, and in that case, because one incident happened, next time you're going to increase his premium by 30-40%, guess what will happen? They will drop off from that. They will not provide that product to the employer
Yeah.
and then your LTV is screwed. So until and unless you create a product which is completely focused on the SMB as a provider, that's the vicious cycle in which the insurance companies are, and that's why this market is not getting solved. So you'll have to break that by pulling it up and doing an underwriting which is specific to the this particular segment and not for the larger groups per se.
And just one final question, and is Onsurety using prop data to actually help insurance companies do underwriting better for this specific subsegment?
No, so right now, like because of the multiple regulations, they do not do the underwriting per se, but they work very closely with the insurer, let's say, because they have the pipes to give the insurer data.
Right.
So they do not undertake the underwriting because it's a regulated space.
Super. Thanks, Anand. Speaking of data, a burning question has been, I think Anand and I have spoken this at length. In the last 5 years, the amount of data that has been consumed, that's become available on borrowers, has probably grown by a million X, right? What is the impact of that data? Has the data really made a difference to underwriting, to collections? And where do you see that playing out? Because ultimately, a fintech lender like yourself probably ingest thousands of points of data, right? So would love to hear where is that sort of continuum at least.
Sure. Happy to answer that, Ravi. I agree that data has a lot of role to play, right? Even when we are, sourcing, right, to ensure that we source the right target market, we do use a lot of data. Even when it's underwriting, to ensure that we lend to the right sort of applicant. And then even, in terms of portfolio management, to ensure we're on top of our portfolio, right? Just to give an example of what we do in the underwriting stage, right? We use a lot of data from the banking statement of the applicant to figure out seasonality of their business, cyclicality of their business, what is the size of the business, from how many customers are they earning that income, to get a sense of customer diversification, right? All of this allows us to judge their behavior, right? And which is where, let's say, the banking behavior of a garment manufacturer is very different from that of, let's say, an auto component manufacturer, right?
Right.
This has been very helpful to us, right? But I think on the point that you are making, right, is that yes, there is tons of data available, right? Lots and lots of data available. I think the onus is on you, how much signals you are able to capture from the noise out there, right? Otherwise, people talk, a lot of, AI ML that they try working on data, but frankly, with the startup around for 3-4 years, I think it's a bit of a challenge, right? I think you also have to be honest to yourself that what is the data you can use, what is relevant, right? And ensure that you use it in the right manner, because else it boils down to more like a garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yeah.
So ensuring that you sort of have a sort of a steady head in terms of focusing on the right metrics. I think that's where data can be helpful. Otherwise, it's just a piece of data. That's it.
No, thank you for that. Rohit, switching to you, you're in a space where it's early, it's niche, but massive potential going forward. For any founders out there who are in some of these spaces, what is your advice at GTM? Because you have banks on one side who probably take 6 months to actually make an API live. Then you have a bunch of incoming inquiries that you spoke about, but a lot of these companies are not quite sure what they want. They're trying to figure and feel their sort of space out. So how do you build a meaningful, repeatable, scalable GTM from where you are today and going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one is you have to go horizontal, right? So especially if you're an infrastructure player, I use the AWS analogy, right, here very frequently, and it's very apt as well. Just like the way AWS expanded its market share was by focusing on one item and then really going horizontal very fast. And going horizontal took a preference over going deeper, right? So going deeper essentially became eventuality. And you can see the way AWS stands right now. And this is one of the reasons why horizontal infrastructure players become powerful, because they give you that modularity. But as I said, the pace of modularity and the pace of horizontal development has to be extremely fast. So I think that's one thing which I would really recommend to anybody who is starting out in this domain, to think horizontal from day one, right? And make sure that you have this horizontal stack covered. Could be, just, for example, KYC plus data, fraud management as well, which is a whole big space itself. Or it could be banking plus payments, which is also a whole big. So I think that space has to be picked out based on your own, inclination and the market opportunity. But it has to be horizontal. That is for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think, and from the banking side, I think, as I said, right, so this is really early days in India. So, As long as you are able to build horizontal, the value to the provider also increases substantially. So it's like a double advantage that you get, not just from the customer side, but also from the supply side.
Interesting. And I think clearly you have chosen the horizontal path, and the constant debate with for founders is, do I go horizontal, do I go vertical? But super interesting. Thank you. One quick question, Anand, before we sort of jump out. In your mind, what are the sort of, if a founder today wants to build something in InsurTech, what areas do you think you should focus on where there is a dire need for innovation? And do touch upon areas like how product innovation in India is hard because IRDA has a very close sort of control on that, and also talk about distribution. But give us a sense on, in your mind, what are the 2-3 areas that founders should focus on?
Yeah, no, that's a difficult one because in InsurTech, generally it will come very from deep down. I'll talk about 3 and I'll make it short, and we can go deeper into them. First is parametric insurance. I believe there is a huge case for parametric insurance, especially on the weather-related parametric insurance. If you look in Philippines, how they have tackled the cyclone-related parametric insurance. In India, we have floods every year. There is no reason why we should not have parametric insurances, and companies building on that. The second one was more around what you see is that some sort of businesses around the infrastructure or digitization of the insurance companies themselves. So if you look at companies like Duck Creek or Magico in US, they have gotten IPO'd and created based on multiple use cases where insurance companies themselves are not able to create digital policies and others. So there will be surely use cases which will come over there. Third one, which we talked about, was more embedded insurance. That how do you embed the insurance in the more use cases? How do you find out the unit economics around this? How does it work to take relevant at time, very fast turnaround insurances? India will definitely see the use case for that as well. So these 3 areas I look into.
And do you see any merit in companies who are trying to sort of build pipes around claims of insurance, latest updates, statuses, making claim processing easier? Or do you think that's a thing that insurance companies are better positioned to solve?
See, if you think about it, parametric insurance is one way to solve claims. So definitely there is a merit to do that. In the health insurance, and see, life insurance is a very low frequency claims. This thing, I think the claims problem is more acute in a high frequency and such scenario. In health and all, I'm seeing a bunch of companies trying to solve it as a TPA++ model. I believe there is a use case over there, but the use case has to be much more well ingrained with the hospital on the software side to solve it well. If it is becoming more a services player, you will see more the TPAs will get acquired by the insurance companies themselves, and they will take them in-house. So if you have a software play which integrates the source of data or can create third-party data sources, for example, in the health example itself, if tomorrow National Health Stack comes in and actually data is uploaded over there, there should not be any claims process. It should be a parametric claim itself, because as soon as the data goes up, there should be the which should happen from which should get triggered by a smart contract. So those sort of things definitely. But if it is a TPA++ with a large services angle to it, I don't think there is a duplicate.
Spot on. I think that's a spot on view. Thanks, Anand. Let's just switch tracks, guys. I think what we're also trying to do is we're trying to get the panelists to sort of trouble each other by asking questions, and Anand has been at the forefront of it. So Anand, Kshitij has a question. Kshitij, Anand has a question for you.
Sure.
He wants to find out liquidity and how do you sort of solve for liquidity, especially in the SME segment? Is that is that how you want to think of that question, Anand?
Yeah, it's like especially given unsecured loans, and given that the digital loans are like banks have their own relationships and all that sort of thing. How are you, given the current scenario, which is seeing a lot of liquidity crisis, a fast growing company, how does it tackle it? This is more a startup question than lending and the NBFC question, because you have the challenge of maintaining that fast growing company tag as well. So how do you tackle that in the liquidity and the supply side?
Yeah.
And Kshitij, just to pile on the pressure, if you answer this question right, a term sheet is coming your way from Anand.
Yeah, honestly, Anand, we sort of solved for this question 3-4 years back itself when we were starting up, right? Because I think we were very clear what is the agenda. The agenda is to solve for lending to small businesses. Agenda is not to be on a treadmill and every month, every quarter keep on raising debt from the market, right? Which is where we started a co-lending partnerships with IDFC Bank, IndusInd Bank. Today we have Incred Ugro with us as well, right? So of the close to about 400 crores of debt we would have raised till date, half of that is all co-lenders, right? So what it allows us to do is that in times like this, right, we ramp up our business through the co-lending model, right? And most of these models are 80-20. In fact, I think we were one of the early entrants into the co-lending piece 4 years back. And today, actually, both RBI and the Finance Ministry actually has been pushing this co-lending agenda through the other banks as well. So very happy to see how it is taking up pace, so that we know as an institution that our focus is more on scaling up the business, ensure that we capture a larger market share, and collaborate with the bank through which a lot of funding liquidity keeps on coming in. So yeah, for us, we sort of solved this about 4 years back for ourselves, Anand.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Rohit Anand, there's a question for you. Impact of OCEN and Sahamati on banking APIs, challenging or favorable for BaaS players like yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, yeah, so the Sahamati, if you look at it, right, as is essentially creating that public good of connecting the regulated players, right? So we don't connect regulated players, and I mean, technically, mostly the banking as a service players don't look at connecting regulated players with each other, because of Sahamati, we realized fairly early on, like 2016, 17, that government was going to step in and try to solve that for themselves, and with good reason, right? I mean, that is definitely their domain, and I think they are well equipped to do that as well. We're looking at the unregulated and the regulated connection, right? Where you have fintechs, marketplaces, neobanks, or the whole gamut of these industries, which is rapidly expanding, and has like no streamlined way of one getting access to data. And data is a small part of it. It's just like 10% of the puzzle, right? More important is making those transactions, actually enabling those workflows, issuing banking instruments, issuing cards, so on and so forth. That's the one we focus on, right? And that is something which, I mean, Sahamati is not really looking at. It's, as I said, it's not really their forte. The forte will be the regulated entity. So I think on the regulated connection side, they'll be extremely helpful. And I'm sure pretty much, whenever they go live, which of course has been a whole different, discussion altogether. They've taken a long, long time to really, go to the market because of the reasons beyond their control sometimes. So that's something which is, still in the works, I would say. But yes, if and when it does go live, for sure, it's going to be extremely helpful, for players like us.
Interesting. Thanks, Rohit. Anand, a couple of questions. Kshitij has a question for you. Kshitij wonders, you guys haven't made a lot of full stack lending investments. Is there a thesis that you don't want to do NBFC/full stack investments, or you are just waiting to find the right team? Give us a sense where you guys are on that sort of frontier.
We are anyways a bottoms-up investor. So your second part of the question is definitely answered over there, that we are always waiting for the right team. Most of the time, we will figure out that an entrepreneur will come and give a certain unique insight, which will tell us that whatever we are thinking is wrong. And that's probably the slam dunk case in which investment happens. So that second part of question is always over there. We're always waiting for the right team. For the first question, part of the question, we do see some challenges on the lending side in a full stack lender, not in terms of like them being as a business, but of the power law that we want to get from our companies. In which case, does it become wrong for us to push our companies to go that fast? In Nexus, we are very like conservative investors. We do 4-5 investments a year, but we want to stay and help our companies very strongly. The challenge that happens is that if I want to grow the lending company at the same rate as which will give us a return, it will cause an impact on the NPAs. It will cause a liquidity problem. Then as an investor, I'm actually doing more harm to the company than actually helping the company grow. And as an investor, while we have a fiduciary responsibilities to our LPs, we also have a responsibility to our founder. So if you ask me, till the time I do not get a very unique insight from a founder that they can match that power curve, I think I'm not the right investor for them. And it's very important that for a founder also to get a right investor. Otherwise, it's not a match which will work in their favor also. That's how I think at the problem. But happy and keenly looking for right and right founders all the time.
No, I think that's sage advice to all sort of fintech lending founders out there who want to pitch to Anand guys. Rohit has a question for you, Anand, and he wants to know, since you look at SaaS deeply, are you seeing a lot of SaaS companies within the API banking space from your lens? And if yes, what have you liked and where would you like to see more of that?
And that's the question for me, Ravi. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we are seeing, and the unique thing is that we see both India and US. So definitely API lending is API in the banking or the fintech domain is becoming a very, very interesting place. There are multiple layers in which it is coming. So broadly to classify, there is a data layer. That's where the question on Samati was, that the consent and the data layer, how does it work? There is a money flow layer where the read and write capabilities go, which could be your banking accounts, it could be a card rail, and it could be other things. And then there is another layer which is completely around the post, I would say, the other activities around the tertiary activities around any financial products, which is like, let's say KYC, let's say reconciliation, let's say other such facilities. So there are these 3-4 broad buckets in which you are seeing API layers getting created, and then valuable companies are getting created. For example, card layer, you'll see Marketer and Marketer equivalent, like Yap and others which will get created over here. The Plaid is the data layer, but unfortunately or fortunately in India, Samati will probably and Samati will get
correct.
Getting created. So while we are talking about banking API layers, we should be very clear about what are the nuances and which category, and given the regulatory framework or the infrastructure framework of that country, what bucket will actually work in the API layer versus not work out.
Sorry, go ahead.
Last bucket which I missed was the increasingly we are seeing some companies coming up in the third bucket, in the payroll and the gig economy, or sort of a passion economy segment, where the current rails do not help the data capture. So you cannot get from account aggregation capture what the salary of a creator over there is. So there is an API layer, API SaaS play coming over there as well. So,
and do you feel that at least in India, apart from companies like Rohit, who building sort of banking infrastructure layers, is the card layer the next place where a lot of players seem to be finding traction? The marketers of India, is that where you think that the action is today?
Yeah, card is an interesting play, but there are both side and the con over there in my mind, and I know Rohit can add much more to this as well. In India, card is an penetrated segment. We have only 58 million credit card outstanding. Obviously, the number of debit cards are much higher. So there is an angle that now, and we have at least more than 100 million people who are rotating credit eligible, like BNPL eligible. So there is a thesis that these people will take cards, BNPL will grow, and because of that, the card rails will grow. Now, the other angle to that, which it sort of suppresses this thought process, is that is card, if you think about credit card is only a mechanism, and it's actually a rotating credit product. With the reason why cards had not picked up in India was because of a very low acceptance network, where you have to have POS in all the places where this will be accepted. That has been completely democratized by the advent of the QR codes. Now everything is coming on QR code. So do you actually need card as a form factor to have a credit card now, is what is being questioned. And if that gets fundamentally questioned, then how important is the credit card rails or systems around that? That will get questioned. So now it will play out in the next 3-4 years is what my take is.
Perfect. No, I think we're running out of time. With one quick question, Kshitij, Rohit had for you. His question was, how can banks and fintech lenders like yourself be better prepared for the embedded lending wave, right? Is it a policy? Is it a strategy? How would you be ready? Because today, with guys like Finbox, with guys like Rupify, etc., technically anybody can become a financial services company, anybody can become a lender. So how would you be better prepared for that?
Yeah, Ravi, as I said, right, I think, the current sort of, disruption that's happening in the financial services space, right? Everyone will have a role to play, right? It's a pretty big market, right? If I were just to talk about the SME lending space, right, it's close to about $500 billion, right? And there is space for everyone, right? I think as long as people, startups identify the niche for themselves and focus on that, I think that's the key. In fact, I would not even sort of shy away from saying that today, look at the co-lending thing that we do with banks, right? Historically, people would have always said that would fintechs compete with banks, but probably not, right? I think fintechs in the right manner have collaborated with banks so that they can scale up, right? To Anand's point, right? As I said, right? For us, that scale up thing is because the liquidity keeps on coming from these partner banks that we have, right? We have never sort of really been bothered by that. It's how you sort of structure that business rather than saying there is a mammoth bank and we'll go after that bank. That's not the way of forward. Similarly, with all of these lending as a service, right? If there are some of these platforms which have better insights into a certain segment, I think people are always open to collaboration, right? And probably that's the only way forward, right? So that you know that you have an expertise in a specific space, and for anything else, go and collaborate, right? So I don't think so there is any harm in collaborating as you start scaling a business. And frankly, coming back to the same point, I think we are at that Lego movement for financial services. There are sort of different niches, different specialities that are coming up, and probably that's the way forward.
Super. Like on that note, guys, everyone, thank you so much for attending. Kshitij, Rohit, Anand, thank you for sparing your valuable time. Take care, guys. These are difficult times, so please be safe. Take care of your family. Thank you again, guys. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure.